There are moments in geopolitics when a place stays exactly where it is, but what it represents changes completely. Kaliningrad has not shifted an inch. Its coastline remains unchanged. Its ports still open onto the Baltic Sea. Its rail lines still run east through Lithuania, toward the Russian mainland, and yet almost overnight. In strategic terms, Kaliningrad has shifted from being one of Russia's most valuable military assets to one of Vladimir Putin's most dangerous liabilities. Not because of an invasion, not because of a dramatic NATO announcement, not because a single shot was fired, but because the assumptions that once shielded it no longer apply. For decades, Kaliningrad existed inside a kind of geopolitical bubble, an enclave wrapped in deterrence, ambiguity and fear. It was Russia's western fortress, its forward-deployed fist pressed against the heart of Europe. From Kaliningrad, Moscow could threaten NATO capitals, dominate the Baltic Sea, and remind neighboring states that Russia's reach extended far beyond its borders. That was the theory. The reality unfolding now looks very different. A fortress built on assumptions. Kaliningrad's power was never only about weapons. It was about psychology. The enclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania was designed to make NATO hesitate. It housed advanced air defense systems, including S-400 batteries. It hosted Iskander missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. It served as the home of Russia's Baltic Fleet. On paper, it was a dense concentration of military capability that could turn any regional clash into a high-risk confrontation. But more important than what was deployed there was what NATO was assumed not to do. For years, Russian military doctrine rested on a quiet, almost sacred belief Kaliningrad was untouchable, not because it could not be struck, but because striking it would escalate too fast. Too dangerously, any move against Kaliningrad, the logic held, would risk nuclear confrontation, and because of that risk, NATO would always choose restraint. That belief shaped everything. It allowed Russia to posture aggressively elsewhere. It gave Moscow confidence to threaten its neighbors. It allowed Putin to treat Kaliningrad as a shield, rather than a hostage. But shields only function when everyone agrees not to strike them. That agreement is now breaking as NATO stops speaking in code. The shift did not begin with tanks. It began with language when Polish General Jaroslaw Gromadski, a former commander of a NATO multinational corps, stated openly that if Russia attacked NATO, the alliance would not confine itself to defense and could move into Kaliningrad. He did something extraordinary. He removed the euphemisms for decades. NATO communicated through carefully calibrated phrases: deterrence, defensive posture, proportional response. What Gromadski did was strip away the diplomatic cushioning and say the quiet part out loud. Kaliningrad is no longer off the table. Even more striking was how far he went. He did not merely hint at a limited incursion. He spoke of total destruction, of rendering the enclave militarily unusable, of burning down the infrastructure that gives it value. This was not a threat made in the heat of a crisis. It was not a reaction to an immediate provocation. It was a statement of a new strategic reality, and Moscow heard it because when generals stop hedging their words, it usually means planning has already moved beyond theory. The geography that once empowered Kaliningrad is now turning into a cage. Its vulnerability is not new. What is new is that those vulnerabilities are now being exploited. Deliberately, the enclave is connected to mainland Russia by land and rail. Only through Lithuania that was always a weakness. It simply never mattered until it did. When Lithuanian railways suspended shipments linked to Russian energy companies, including Lukoil, the decision was presented as a technical and commercial risk assessment, but geopolitics does not care about labels. The effect was unmistakable. A critical logistical artery was severed. Fuel is not a luxury in modern warfare. It is oxygen with land routes restricted. Russia is now heavily reliant on maritime supply across the Baltic Sea. On paper, that sounds manageable. In reality, it introduces a new set of problems, ones Moscow cannot easily control. The Baltic Sea is no longer a permissive environment for Russia. NATO surveillance is constant. Naval patrols are frequent. Undersea infrastructure is closely monitored. And Russia's reliance on its so-called shadow fleet, vessels that evade sanctions, switch off as transponders and operate in legal gray zones, only intensifies scrutiny. Calhoun and Grad, once a forward base projecting power, is increasingly an island under watch. And islands are only as strong as their supply lines. The cost of a war fought elsewhere is now being felt. This is where Ukraine matters. Russia's war in Ukraine has consumed resources on a scale modern Europe has not witnessed in generations. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded. Massive losses in armor, artillery, and trained personnel units were pulled out of Kaliningrad to reinforce fronts that were buckling under pressure. The result is a hollowing out effect on paper. Russia maintains between 20,000 and then 30,000 troops in Kaliningrad. In practice, many of those units are undertrained, undersupplied, and stripped of experienced leadership. The Baltic Fleet remains formidable on paper, but naval power without secure logistics is a performance, not a guarantee. This matters because deterrence is not just about what you possess. It is about whether your adversary believes you can actually use it, and that belief is eroding. Kaliningrad was designed to raise the cost of confrontation for NATO. What it is doing now is raising the cost for Russia. Defending the enclave during a crisis would require Moscow to divert forces it no longer has. Supplying it under pressure would demand maritime access that can be contested, escalating to nuclear threats. Once the ultimate trump card, now risks triggering precisely the conventional response Russia fears. In other words, Kaliningrad has inverted the equation. It no longer deters NATO from acting. It constrains Russia from acting freely. This is the strategic nightmare. If Russia threatens the Baltic states or Poland, NATO does not need to respond symmetrically. It can respond where Russia is weakest by isolating, neutralizing, or destroying Kaliningrad. And once that option exists credibly, the enclave becomes a hostage to Moscow's own behavior. Poland's response makes this shift tangible. The Eastern Shield Project fortifications, anti-tank obstacles surveillance systems, and troop deployments along Poland's eastern border is not defensive theater, it is preparation. Preparation not only to hold ground, but to manage escalation. Combined with broader Baltic defense initiatives and rising defense spending across the region, it signals something deeper. Europe no longer believes time is on Russia's side. For years, Putin relied on Western hesitation, on endless debates on internal divisions, on the belief that democracies move slowly and avoid risk. Ukraine shattered that illusion. Kaliningrad is now revealing what comes next. Perhaps the most striking element of this moment is how little weight Russia's nuclear signaling carries here. Kaliningrad hosts nuclear-capable missiles. That fact once froze decision-making in Western capitals. Today it does not. Why? Because NATO has learned painfully that allowing nuclear blackmail to dictate conventional outcomes only invites more blackmail. The alliance's posture has shifted from avoiding escalation at any cost to managing escalation with clarity. The message is subtle but firm. Nuclear weapons do not grant immunity for conventional aggression. When General Gromyky spoke of destroying Kaliningrad, he was not dismissing the nuclear risk. He was reframing it. He was saying that Russia cannot assume escalation dominance. Simply by brandishing nuclear capability, that is a profound change. Empires often construct strongholds on their edges, believing those fortresses protect the core. History is full of examples showing how that logic fails. Kaliningrad was meant to anchor Russia's western flank. Instead, it has become the point where Russia's strategic weaknesses converge. Overextension, depleted manpower, fragile logistics, a deterrence doctrine built for a world that no longer exists. The irony is sharp. The more Russia threatens its neighbors, the more exposed Kaliningrad becomes. The more Moscow relies on intimidation, the more it invites counterplanning. The louder the nuclear rhetoric, the clearer the conventional vulnerabilities appear. Kaliningrad has not been attacked, but it is no longer shielded by silence. What this moment truly represents is not an imminent NATO invasion. It is not a sudden collapse tomorrow. It is the slow, unmistakable shift of leverage. Kaliningrad now constrains Russia more than it constrains NATO. It forces Moscow to calculate risks it once ignored. It narrows escalation options. It exposes the cost of aggression. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals a deeper truth about the war Russia chose to fight. By exhausting itself in Ukraine, the Kremlin has weakened its entire strategic perimeter. Kaliningrad is not an isolated issue, it is a symptom of a state that assumed endurance was limitless, a system that believed manpower could always replace planning. A leadership that confused fear with stability. Kaliningrad was supposed to project power westward. Now it projects vulnerability inward, and in geopolitics, reversals like this do not announce themselves with explosions. They announce themselves quietly. With planners redrawing maps, with generals speaking plainly, with assumptions being silently removed. That is how fortresses become traps.